Thanks, everyone, and really happy to be here to speak on this issue of misinformation and disinformation. What I'm going to try to do today is firstly cover some definitions around these terms, because these terms can be quite confusing and often used in different ways. I also speak about the current context of the situation now with the pandemic, and see how misinformation is happening, but also what are some of the state responses to misinformation that's currently being documented by civil society groups in different countries. I'll also then speak a bit about the human rights standards related to freedom of expression, and how these links to some of the issues around restrictions and what's acceptable within international human rights law. And then finally, I will propose some best practices and effective responses that have been put forward by UN experts and other actors who've been studying this particular issue. So moving on to definitions in my next slide. So firstly, to clarify that the term misinformation, okay, great. So on the terms misinformation and disinformation, there has been no kind of universally accepted or used definition. There are varying perspectives around what these terms mean and so forth. But I think one of the definitions I have often referenced to with misinformation is the inadvertent or unintentional spread of false or inaccurate information without malicious intent. So often information, we receive information on social media or online that could be satire, could be just poor journalism, could be partially true, could be put in a false context. So this information often circulates with friends and so forth, but they do not have a particular malicious intent. Is how often one defines misinformation in that sense. While disinformation is often defined as the false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed specifically to presented and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. So it's a very different tactic than how misinformation spreads. And disinformation often can be used by individuals, but also by states and political parties in how they go about, putting out information. So I think it's very important to understand both these terms. I'll be focusing a lot of my presentation on misinformation, because this is where we see a lot of the restrictions to freedom of expression happening that's been documented by CIVICUS and other groups. Also, it's very important I want to note here that the term fake news is often bandied around, and we see it in many pieces of legislation and discussions online. But for many academics and experts, this term is not the most helpful when trying to identify the particular challenge we're trying to address. The problem is that in many laws, they are ambiguously defined, very broad and extremely vague. And I think the further problem with the term fake news is that it's been appropriated by governments, politicians, and others to denigrate coverage or reporting which they simply dislike. And for these and other reasons, there is, I think, a growing acknowledgement that other terms should be used in place. So just to clarify that while I'll be speaking about the term fake news that's used by governments, it isn't a term that is often recommended as a way to talk about misinformation or disinformation. So moving on, what is the current context that we are operating at the moment with the pandemic? I think we realized that there's a lot of information circulating within our countries. And in February of this year, the World Health Organization had raised concerns about what they called an infodemic caused by a flood of false and misleading information about COVID-19. We have seen social media posts advancing bogus cures, conspiracy theories, and inaccurate reports of the virus spreading, which is sometimes viewed more than information than from authoritative sources. At times, some of these information often creeps into our reporting of traditional media outlets who refer to some of these information which may not be fully true. And I think this is something that we recognize. And thirdly, also with the COVID-19 outbreak, we have also seen information flooding about that stoking fear, discrimination and intolerance in many parts of the world, targeting individuals or particular communities. So there's been a lot going on that we are dealing with, and obviously this is a very new scenario, and both governments and other actors are trying to deal with it. But I just wanted to paint the broad picture linked to misinformation that's going on at the moment. So how have states responded to misinformation? One of the things that we are seeing from our documentation is that in their efforts to address some of these challenges, governments unfortunately have at times embraced quite heavy-handed measures in trying to check misinformation. We have seen a number of governments apply restrictive laws governing what they claim to be fake news, or laws related to online communications or cyber crimes laws to arrest, investigate, and charge those supposedly spreading untruths about the virus. We've also seen attempts to silence criticism of the state and by against individuals, and to censor or restrict information on the COVID-19 pandemic. So there are multiple ways where states have been responding to this issue, which is quite problematic from a civil society perspective. And this is creating what we call a chilling effect for key actors and key partners that the governments actually have to be working to fight against the virus. This includes human rights defenders, media and journalists, civil society organizations. We also see whistleblowers being affected, vulnerable groups, and overall we feel that this undermines the effort in many states to tackle the pandemic. Also the problem with censoring or suppressing information about the COVID-19 virus is that it increases public distrust with the information being put out by governments when they try to hide information about this, and a number of countries we have seen that also. So what are some of the what's happening in the different states in this region with regards to the use of some of these laws? For example, here in Malaysia, where I'm based, we've seen the police open at least 217 investigation papers into what they claim is COVID-related fake news. With at least, I think as of this week, 23 people charged in court for this. In countries like Vietnam, we have seen the authorities cracking down on those using Facebook and also bloggers who are trying to deliver timely information about the deadly outbreak, given that the state-controlled media implements very strict censorship over information. From our data, at least 654 individuals who've posted on Facebook about the virus have been summoned by the police for interrogation, and a lot of them have also been fined for disseminating information. In the Philippines, we've seen the declaration of the state of emergency, which I'm sure Emily will be speaking about later, and the passing of laws that includes provisions penalizing the spreading of false information on social media and other platforms. These laws also provide provisions to imprison people for at least 2 months for spreading false information. In Indonesia, we have seen also the authorities use criminal defamation laws to crack down on public criticism of the government's response to the outbreak. Based on data collected by human rights groups, at least 51 people have been charged under criminal defamation laws for allegedly spreading fake news about the coronavirus. And lastly, also in Thailand, we have seen similarly, at the end of March, we saw an artist charged under the Computer Crimes Act in Thailand for a Facebook post criticizing the lack of screening for COVID-19 at the Bangkok airport when he arrived at the airport. So he was sharing this information online, and he was charged subsequently under this particular draconian law. So I think we are seeing multiple countries resort to these forms of restrictions and laws when combating misinformation, and I think this is something that human rights groups particularly have serious concerns on how this violates freedom of expression that many of the countries are protected in law and policies. Now, what about disinformation? Because we hear less about disinformation in many of our conversations, but there is growing evidence of what we call organized social media manipulation campaigns taking place in numerous countries around the world. A study by the Oxford Internet Institute that was done last year shows that at least 70 or more countries around the world where there's been recorded instances of disinformation being used primarily by states but also by other actors in these different countries. And what are some of the manifestations of these disinformation campaigns or tactics? Firstly, we see the spreading of pro-government or pro-party propaganda online that is quite organized by groups. We also see the attacking of opposition or smear campaigns targeting opposition actors in numerous countries where this has been documented. Disinformation also tends to be used to distract or divert conversations on criticism away from important issues. So it's used when there are national issues being debated. Disinformation is often used to divert those critical conversations online and move it to other conversations. So this is something that we have seen, and also to suppress participation through personal attacks or harassments, where individual activists, individual politicians, and others have been attacked online at a personal level as part of a larger disinformation campaign. I'm going to give just two examples of it. There are many examples out there, but so one example is in the Philippines, where on the 1st of April, we saw that a hashtag which states "Outs Duterte Now" trending on social media following a televised address by the president around the COVID-19 pandemic. Not long after, there was a barrage of troll posts defending the president that was circulated on social media. And monitoring that dissemination, we saw a lot of blocks of text being copied and pasted and then shared online on multiple social media platforms, which included the hashtag "I stand with the president." And so after a couple of days, on the 10th of April, Twitter reported that they had taken down hundreds of accounts of tweets under this specific hashtag because these accounts violated its policies against platform manipulation and spamming. So this is one incident of how disinformation tactics were used at a mass scale in response to a particular hashtag that was trending. In Vietnam, we know of a particular unit called Force 47 in Vietnam, which is an army of about 10,000 cyber soldiers, which is run by the Ministry of Public Security, informally known as the Public Opinions Brigade. And this particular unit are highly organized units of commentators and trolls that participate in online forums on social media. They tend to edit Wikipedia entries, but they also have been countering critical content and spreading pro-government narratives online. So these are just two examples of how disinformation tactics are being used at a mass scale, basically to divert attention, to distract on current issues that are being debated, but also to mount smear campaigns against those who are critical. And it's important that as lawmakers, I think, that we be aware of these kinds of tactics being used. So moving on, I want to speak a bit about the international standards on freedom of expression, which I'm sure many of you already are aware of, but it'll be good just to clarify them. So the right to freedom of expression is protected by, firstly, Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which virtually all countries have sort of signed up to. And it's also given force in Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which many ASEAN countries have ratified. Freedom of expression provisions are also in many of our national constitutions and also in national laws. So this is a right that's protected for many citizens and others within the ASEAN region. The scope of the right to freedom of expression is extremely broad. If you look at Article 19(2) of the ICCPR, it requires states to guarantee to all people freedom to seek, to receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media of their choice. So it's a very broad right that protects various forms of receiving, seeking information. And UN experts have said that these rights do not just apply offline, but they also apply online today in the reality of our times, that a lot of expression is happening online. So this is a right that's guaranteed under international law. I would also like to note that the human rights to impart information and ideas is not limited just to correct statements. The right also protects information that sometimes may shock, may offend, and may disturb. So it's a very broad reading of the right to freedom of expression that has been, clarified by UN experts and other people who have looked at this issue. So it's not just about correct statements alone, and this links to when we talk about misinformation. Now, there's often a caveat with this, that we recognize that while the right to freedom of expression is fundamental, that it's not absolute. There are provisions within international law to allow for restrictions in order to protect legitimate state interests, including public health. So we've seen attempts in this pandemic to restrict the right to freedom of movement, which can be justified under international law if it clearly is about a particular legitimate state interest. However, also the Human Rights Committee has stated that any restrictions must be exceptional, and we are living in exceptional times, but also must meet the three-part test that's often used when trying to see whether a restriction is justified or not. And I'm going to go through quickly this three-part test because I think it's important as lawmakers that when you're looking at legislation to ensure that it meets this test. Firstly, any kind of legislation must be provided for by law, and it must be consistent with international standards. And therefore, any restrictions that are given effect by a law or regulation must be formulated with sufficient precision to enable individuals to adapt their conduct accordingly. The problem with many of the laws that have been drafted or have been legislated around misinformation and so forth are extremely vague and broad. We see terms like causing annoyance, creating confusion, about false news, about offending or creating disunity. These are extremely broad terms that lack the precision that it's required under international law for a particular law to be, for a particular restriction to be justified. So this is something to take into account. Secondly, it must pursue a legitimate aim. So any restriction must target one of the state interests enumerated in Article 19 of the ICCPR. And this list includes the protection of national security, public order, public health, and so forth. So there are clearly restrictions that are justified in the name of state interest, but it cannot be used to stifle criticism or dissent of the state. And again, we've seen in numerous instances where these kinds of laws are being used to arrest and detain people who have been criticizing state policies or criticizing individuals and so forth. And I think this is a really misuse of the law that's being practiced. And finally, the other part of the test is that the state must demonstrate a specific and individualized fashion of the precise nature of the threat and the necessity and proportionality of the specific action taken. So what does this mean in practice? It means that the state must establish that there is a direct link or immediate connection between the expression and the threat of violence, discrimination, or hostility. So that must be clearly linked. So for example, if I said something, or if I made a speech that led to an attack on a particular community or to attack on, say, a religious place, and if the state can show a link between my speech and that particular incident, then that restriction is justified. But often we see many restrictions being imposed where the evidence about the link between the speech and the actual incident is very weak often. So we can't show that it's created confusion or created disunity. So there's a problem with the legislation itself. We also know that under international law, where there is provocation of advocacy of hatred on these protected grounds of incitement to violence, then states can intervene in those circumstances. But again, these circumstances must be exceptional and must be clearly defined in law. So what are some of the best practices or effective responses to misinformation that we have seen being practiced in different countries, either before the pandemic, but also now while the pandemic has occurred? And these are recommendations by UN experts. They are no way exhaustive, but these are some of the recommendations that I have compiled, which I feel will be useful in your conversations with other lawmakers and so forth. I think the first message that the experts are saying is that the public authorities should refrain from relying on criminal prosecution and other coercive measures as a primary means of combating misinformation. And therefore, what the call is that any laws that are there that currently do not are inconsistent with international standards on freedom of expression should be repealed or amended, and that government should be placing a moratorium on these laws until reforms take place. So that's a very clear message that multiple UN experts have issued in many of their statements and studies. Another recommendation is that, and this is pretty straightforward and understandable, is to disclose information, that government should proactively disclose information related to the spread of COVID-19. Information is essential to ensuring effective responses to the virus, including the implementation of protective measures by the public. So we know that multiple countries have been holding press conferences on a regular basis, have been disseminating information. And I think that's a very important way of combating misinformation that is circulating online. And I think this is something that we need to practice consistently. Also, another recommendation is for governments to use freedom of information legislation to facilitate access to public information, including mandating disclosure of certain types of information and establishing a system for individuals and groups to request information from public bodies. So where information is not public, there should be systems in place within the government to allow whether it be journalists or human rights groups or others to access that information, so that information can flow where it's needed for people to understand better what's happening with the pandemic. Another strategy that some countries have also used is to combat misinformation online is to issue daily or weekly statements debunking misinformation and providing the correct information. We have seen a number of countries do that, where they provide a statement at the end of each day saying that this certain information has been circulating online, it is inaccurate, and then providing the accurate information. So it's a very quick and easy way of ensuring that we are combating misinformation. The protection of whistleblowers is another critical strategy that government should ensure their protection, because whistleblowers are critical at this time to ensure to be able to reveal information about what's happening on the ground, and they should be able to do that without fearing that they themselves will be criminalized for speaking up, like in the case of Thailand, where the person pasted about the lack of testing happening at the airport. So I think that's a very critical element of the strategy. Another thing is also to use fact checkers. That partnerships with third-party fact checkers is extremely useful. We know AFP and others are constantly providing fact checking of information. So this allows people who, when they receive something on WhatsApp or on some other platform, they are able to go and check whether that information is accurate or not in this fact checker spaces. So I think that's something to do. Another thing is to ensure the presence of strong, independent, and adequately resourced public service media, which operates in a very clear mandate to serve the overall public interest and to set high standards of journalism. We know that public media is critical at times like this to disseminate information across the country, but also in multiple languages, because in many countries we have migrant workers, we have refugees who may not be familiar with the national language, and I think it's important that this is disseminated in different ways, but also in different formats, either to written, through photos, and so forth. I think that's a very critical strategy. And finally, I think another message coming is to halt any form of disinformation, that state actors should not make, sponsor, encourage, or further disseminate statements which they know or reasonably know to be false. I think this is very critical, that disinformation be curbed in any way, and a state shouldn't be the ones doing it, but also people who are supportive of political parties and states should end any forms of disinformation that's happening. So these are some of the strategies that we have seen being applied in a number of countries with regards to the virus, responding to the virus, which do not violate international human rights standards. And I think these are things that you can consider in the different countries that you are. I will end it here and pass it back to Quinn. Thank you.